Hello and welcome to a new episode of Other Record Labels. I'm your host, Scott Orr, where we talk about the art and culture of running a record label. And today, I want to talk about the history of record labels. And I'm going to go through the history. I'm going to go as fast as I can. So please bear with me. I'm going to mansplain record labels to you just for a couple of minutes. And then I'm going to teach you two things that I think I personally took away from the history. Because once I dived into the history of record labels, I took away two things that I thought taught me about how this history impacts record labels today, specifically independent record labels today. And so if you run an independent record label, I run an independent record label, and this is what I learned from the history once I learned about the history. I'm going to be saying history a few more times. We go all the way back to like 1910, 1920. A very common way to purchase music was not recorded music, because that had just been invented. It certainly wasn't popular and it didn't sound good, and it didn't even, we'll get into these cylinders in a second, but it was all about sheet music. And so songwriters would write a new song, and then you as a music fan would go to the grocery store or retail store and buy the sheet music. You'd take it home. Whoever played the piano, Auntie you'd all gather around the piano and they would play the new song, and that's how you would listen to music. That's certainly not how we distribute new singles today, but could be a good way to do it. Actually, I think Beck did that, right? Beck did an album a couple years ago just on sheet music, but sheet music was the common way. Before recording, sheet music was how people would actually buy music. Very interesting. And before that, the only way to actually hear music, because there was no mechanism to record anything, it would be Broadway, it would be church, it would just be live music. So anyway, in the 1800s, Thomas Edison invented cylinders. He invented the phonograph. And so basically it was this like tinfoil wrapped around the cylinder that looked like a soda can. He would speak into a microphone and the vibrations would indent onto this tinfoil type of thing. And then you could, there would be a needle that would indent and then another needle that would play it back. And so that was really the first recording. And the first recording ever was Mary Had a Little Lamb. I don't know if Thomas Edison sang it or if he just spoke it, or if he just said the title, Mary Had a Little Lamb. But the first recording was Mary Had a Little Lamb. Over the years, and this is in the late 1800s, Thomas Edison lost interest because he was busy with the light bulb. And so Alexander Graham Bell took over. And what's interesting about this is that it shows us that it wasn't really about entertainment. It was about business. It was about the telephone industry. Some of the initial purposes was recording, like dictation, books for the blind, family records. And so to hear, your grandma's voice after she's passed on, which is kind of a cool thing. Telephone messages. It wasn't really entertainment. So cylinders, again, even though they improved over the years, they were bad. I mean, originally they only held up to 2 minutes of audio. You couldn't duplicate them in any way. So if it was a music performance, then the artist would have to repeat the recording for as many copies as you want. Eventually they did improve. They became black and they had this little bevel, very much like a soda can on the top, this bevel where you could engrave the title of the recording, which was kind of, in a way, the very first incarnation of a record label. In the 1900s, like 1901, I think, or so, Columbia Records came along. And Columbia was originally the seller of these machines, these Edison machines, and they would repair them and they would rent them and they would sell parts for them. And they had exclusive rights in the District of Columbia. But as that relationship with the phonograph it kind of fractured a little bit, Columbia started inventing their own technology, and they actually invented the flat disc, the 10-inch flat disc that we're far more aware of today. And that became the new standard. And eventually cylinders lost popularity, and they started recording opera music. And Victor is another group. Victor. Victor is the Victor Talking Company, I think it was called. And they are the company that you can picture. They did the gramophone, but you can picture the dog listening to the horn. And that branding was called His Master's Voice because the dog heard his master's voice. It was kind of interesting. And it was a great little branding thing. And you still see that today. Interestingly, his master's voice also turned into HMV, which was a big, up until a couple of years ago, was a big retail chain in Canada and the UK. So Columbia Records invented this flat disc, and eventually, within a few years, they invented this double-sided flat disc, and it could be replicated. And so it was a pretty big deal, even though cylinders were improving, and the material they made them out of, and was improving, and the duplication process or replication process became possible. Eventually, the flat disc just completely killed them. And so what's really interesting about this history is that we realized from the very beginning that it was tech companies that were driving this. And so it's not difficult to understand why Philips, a hi-fi audio company, would eventually invent the cassette. And Sony, the inventor of the Walkman and the Discman, would be a part of inventing the CD. And why Apple would be one of the first and the biggest legitimate MP3 retail stores online around the same time that they released the iPod. So we realized that a lot of this, the history of recorded music as we know it, and the history of record labels, were these tech companies who were really just trying to create a means to an end. They wanted to sell more of their big mechanism, these big machines. And so it was important for them to sell more of these discs that people would use on their machines. So from the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s, more and more record labels came onto the scene. The history of independent record labels was interesting because while these major labels existed for mainstream music, independent music came on as a way to represent smaller genres, less mainstream music. And that usually brought with it more loyal fans, less fans, but more loyal fans. And they're also, independent record labels was a really good indicator about what would eventually hit the mainstream, which is totally true today. And so that's one of the cool things about independent record labels. Labels at the time, when we think back to Columbia, having this actual paper label on the center of their 10-inch discs and on the center of their 78s, these hard acetate, what were those things? Lacquer, like these super heavy discs that if you I have a few of them, I should have brought some up here. If you drop them, they'll shatter. They're like a plate. But Columbia had this label, and it's so cool because Columbia is like the second record label. The first record label technically was Edison Records. The second record label was Columbia. And Columbia is still a record label today. They're owned by Sony now, but they're the oldest record label that are still in operation. And what's cool about their labels is they haven't really deviated from that center label. And nor do I think they should. I think there's been different colors and a little bit different changes, but they've used the center label and they copied it over to CDs as well for a really long time. In the 80s, we got what's called the Big Six, and that's Warner, EMI, Sony, BMG, Universal, and Polygram. Over the past 25 years, since the 80s, and oh man, it's the 80s now, 42 years ago. Well, okay. Over the past 30 or 40 years, there's more consolidation, and now we're left with three: Universal, Sony, and Warner. Now, they all have subsidiaries. Island, Def Jam is with Universal. Sony has The Orchard, has Provident, has Columbia, and so on. And then they all have like international branches as well. Independent record labels, I think a good example is Sun Records. And Sun Records did something at the time that was even, maybe illegal or socially unacceptable, but he did some incredible things with pushing rock and redefining genres and promoting, race in music that was not generally allowed on certain radio stations, or some distributors wouldn't do that, and he advocated on that behalf. And I think it represents what independent record labels have done well in the past and what independent record labels still do well now, which is advocating for creatives and for musicians that aren't in the mainstream and that don't get heard. And I think that's what's so amazing about the history of record labels. As we go back to the 50s and the 40s, these labels would pop up. I think one of the first independent record labels was a label called OK, and it was a jazz label. It was spelled OKEH, which was actually at the time an acronym for the guy who founded it, but it was called OK Records. But always from the beginning, independents were about doing something different from major labels. That brings us into our two takeaways, and I'm going to leave you. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but there's two takeaways from this history, and I hope that you're still with me. Number one is that artists no longer need us. It used to be the fact that, in order to record, recording studios were super expensive. And so, our artists totally needed record labels because record labels would either have access to these recording studios. And in the case of 100 years ago, they were the only technology to actually have this music recorded and sold. But they also had access to distribution and to retail stores, and they had access to money to promote these records. And so if you wanted to get on MTV, if you wanted to get in a magazine, if you wanted to get into retail stores like HMV, then you needed to have these record labels. Well, that's just not true today. I mean, the accessibility is massive. Distribution is accessible to everyone. And so what does that mean? We learn that artists don't need us. And we talked about this in our series a couple of weeks ago about why artists need record labels. And here's what I think, that now that we know that artists don't need us, here's what we can bring to them. And why I do think that artists actually do need us is we can offer a creative partnership. We can offer accountability. We can advocate on behalf of the fans and say, listen, this is a great song. You really should release this. We can help them. We can give them an advance or help hook them up with a studio, but even just not necessarily monetary things, we can actually just be encouraging to them and hold them accountable and say, listen, finish this music, write this music, the fans want to hear it. The second thing we can do, even though artists don't need us, is that we can offer experience. And we talked about the knowledge gap a few episodes ago, about you don't have to be an expert to be an expert. You don't actually have to be a super experienced record label or a super profitable record label. All you have to do is know something that these artists don't know. And so I was talking to an artist recently who wanted to upload their music independently to Spotify and to Apple Music, and they were overwhelmed at the distribution options. And there were things that they were afraid of. They were afraid that they wouldn't get paid properly, or that they were signing away the rights to their music forever. Things that were just not true. But because this process was so overwhelming to them, they were afraid, and it prevented them from doing that. And so even though this artist wasn't on my label, I was able to step in and say, hey, well, I can just give you some advice because I've done it before. And so we have this experience. It may not be 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years of experience. We may not have won Grammys or sold millions of records, but at least we have experience that we can share with our artists on our label. And the final thing we can offer them, even though artists don't need record labels, is we offer them community. We offer them a roster of artists that they can collaborate with, that they can commiserate with, or who can encourage and support and promote each other. The final thing, if you stuck with me this whole time, if we've gone through the history of record labels, the final thing that I think that we can learn from the history of record labels is nothing. We learn absolutely nothing, because we realize that we don't need to copy anything from them. We realize that the template that we've been copying for 100 years is based on tech companies, is based on an invention that wasn't even intended for music in the first place. And so we realize that we don't need to take anything from this history. We can completely reinvent the music industry. We can do things completely different. We don't need to follow any rules. We don't need to follow any sort of template. There are things that we do, like an LP, an EP. Why do we use those terms? Singles. Why do we do that? All of this stuff that I teach on this channel, and forgive me, they're good things, obviously, that we can learn from it. But I think that what we can learn from this history is permission to do things our own way and to completely invent something, and to question all of these traditions, and to question what you can innovate and what trails can you blaze on your own and completely change the system. And I think it's great. And we're seeing record labels all over the place who are doing things completely different. People email me from this platform and say that I have a unique position and I want to start a record label from this cool, unique position. And I think that's great. And I think the lesson we can learn from the history of record labels is there really is no rules. There is no template that we must follow. We can do things our own way. And I hope that you find that encouraging and empowering and inspiring. So go to otherrecordlabels.com. I will put this list and a more in-depth history of record labels. If you go on our main page to otherrecordlabels.com and you search, choose your topic, there's all of the previous episodes that we've had and topics and resources that you can download for free. If you're thinking of starting a record label, or if you have an independent record label that you're looking to grow, Go to otherrecordlabels.com, search by topic, or choose your topic, and you can find out more about the history of record labels and all of the resources that we have there. Thanks so much for watching.